Good evening, everyone. Time for episode 6 of the Drums of Doom, part 2 of the Duaredheim staff saga by me. Starting on page 64, at the top, overlapping yesterday's reading, the chapter titled King Rodamon's Mine. Big battle going on. Okay. Vremic was focusing his attacks with the sword only. If he possessed other fighting tools, then he had not thought of using them yet. Jason wasted no time. When Vremic next swung at him from a high, on-guard position, he went low, driving his fist into Vremic's groin. Air exploded from his lungs, and his sword flew from his hands. Jason grasped him, left hand upon Vremic's right wrist, his right clutching Vremic's groin. In one sudden, Herculean effort, he lifted Vremic above his head and hurled him down. It looked like Vremic was beaten. His fellows rose to attack. Vremic laughed from the ground. "Now you will all die. The sword is mine." He had landed close to the golden sword, a mistake on Jason's part, and Vremic now reached out to take it up. Suddenly, it leaped away from him and into the hands of his nemesis. "It seems that you've forgotten the character of your own father's sword. Unfailingly will it return to its rightful living wielder's hand. The blade, at least, has honor." "It will return to me soon, then," Vremic rasped, "for we outnumber you 2-1. It was then that he signaled his knights to attack. Speaking mentally to his fellows, he raged, "Destroy them all with your mental might." Advancing for the killing stroke, they unleashed a mental barrage upon the elves, attempting to shut down, confuse, and disable them. They hurled powerful waves of energy towards their enemies' brains. They were confident that the elves would crumple or weaken, making them easy prey. But they did not know the properties of the very stone around them, and their powers were largely absorbed. What power remained caused little more than a headache to their enemies. It was an undesirable effect indeed, for what more fearsome opponents could there be than Doc Alfar, irritated to the point of deadly action? Jason's charges were foremost in his mind, and he wanted to turn for a moment to signal them back to a position of safety while his team handled the threat. But at that moment, he realized that such orders would go unheeded. Olac had joined him at his left flank with swords drawn, and beside him was a squad of 8 skeletal soldiers, conjured by Tulina from the remains of the mine's fallen. While they lumbered on, as the undead are likely to do, Olac moved fluidly, his eyes riveted on the coming action. Vremic, gaining his feet, had retreated to his cache of armor and weapons, while 12 sentient warriors poured into the cave from their hiding places. 8 was the number of sentient knights that first entered the fray that day, 8 chaotic warriors, hell-bent on destruction. Ornamented suits of mail, coated with precious metals and exquisitely bejeweled, protected their bodies, both tall and strong. Each set was worth a king's ransom, but despite its beauty, it was also protective. Their faces were pale, lean, and hairless, but whether this was the result of grooming or natural conditions, only the sentients knew. In stature, they were heads and shoulders above the elves, and often twice their weight. Their weapons were two-handed and heavily weighted, but as expert swordsmen, they could fence quite well with them. Boots as exotic as the armor protected their feet, and if helmed, their caps were equally ornate. Possessed of diabolical countenance, they were necessarily evil, wholly ruthless, and the most terrible of enemies. The knights advanced, expecting the black elves to be writhing in agony upon the floor. But lo, it was not so, for the elves were advancing to meet them. They must have some strange magic protecting them. It mattered not, for they would still fall before their superior numbers and strength, and they were not without magic themselves. Behind them were 4 sentient warlocks, 2 of them captains, readying their sorcerous might. Olac advanced to the right flank of the undead, who had been long buried in a collapsed tunnel. Tulina had called upon their ancient bones to awaken, and they had answered. Clawing and crawling free of the debris and earth that had buried them, they rose up and found the old tools that they had wielded in life, pickaxe and hammer, hoe and shovel, and they then formed a small company before the Dark Elf priestess. Some of them arrived without arms, ribs, or other appendages, but they had come to her magical call, and they waited for their commands. Attack the sentients, Tulina ordered. Strike them until they are dead and gone. Only then will I release you. It was a command that they could not resist. Tulina's orders contained a promise terrifying to the undead. For what greater fear could they possess than to awaken and find themselves lifeless and not yet reborn, only to look through spirit eyes at a fleshless body beyond their free-willed control? They belonged to Tulina until her spell set them free. Shuffling ahead, their bones scratched the stone in an eerie scritch-scratch, clack, scritch-scratch, click-clack, that sent chills through the bones of the living. They then set themselves upon a rank of sentients, hammers and picks against two-handed swords of war. They had little chance of winning, but knew no living fear, and their presence gave Olac time to choose his actions. 4 warlocks stood behind the knights, preparing wicked spells. He would concentrate upon them. Hearing an arrow streaking toward him, he twisted to avoid it, and batted 2 others out of the air before him. Rolling sideward, he came up at a run. The lead knight moved to stop him. Olac had to be quick. He was more like a beam of light, almost too fast for the naked eye. Lesser foes would have found no time to react, but the well-trained knight was his own master. He placed his blade between them, relying more upon his awareness than his own vision. It saved his life, for Olac's cuts merely pushed his sword aside and impacted his armor as he passed by. The knight would have turned to follow if not for the undead. A shovel struck his helm, driving him back. Something else hammered into his side. Defense was his only option. The Warlocks were a fraction of a second away from unleashing their magic. He could not neutralize them all, but he would do what he could and hope that his comrades would do the rest. The closest mage concentrated upon him, and his gleeful look told Olac that he was certain that his spell would arrive in time to slay him. Olac had no way of knowing the wizard's speed, but the warlock suffered the same handicap. He could not have known that 20 feet was barely 2 running strides away for the Blades Master. The warlock's head rolled away from his shoulders before his lips could complete his incantation. The sentient beside him was forced to leap away in order to avoid the same fate for himself. His spell wasted, he drew forth his own sword without a moment to spare. Olac attacked him expertly, testing the warlock's mettle. He was far more seasoned than he expected, surely a captain. The sentient officer turned his attacks aside with surprising efficiency. Olac could feel his enemy's power through the warlock's blade. It was a supernatural strength beyond the norm, and he then knew that it was either magic or the captain's powerful mind that boosted his natural abilities. A lesser fighter would have sought retreat, but Olac merely shouldered the new challenge, summoning his inner strength. Adrenaline surged through his body, and he pressed ever harder. It was then that his senses became aware of a gathering power. The warlocks behind him were centering their evocation upon him. There was no available cover. His opponent was ever ready to execute a killing stroke. Only with a desperate maneuver could he hope to avoid their spell. Fire erupted around him, magical fire, as hot as dragon's breath. He tucked and rolled backward, curling his swords beneath his arms and pulling his protective cloak about himself. He lay curled in a ball while the heat raged above him. He was like a ground squirrel in his burrow, waiting out a forest fire, confident that his underground home would protect him. He resisted the incinerating waves of heat, gulped the last bit of fresh air beneath his cloak, and rose up as soon as it ended. The sentient captain lay against the cavern wall, a smoking ruin. Gasping for breath, his lungs seared by flame. He tried to rise, but soon fell, and did not rise again. Olac spun. The other warlocks had moved toward the center of the battle behind him. They certainly believed him to be dead. He wanted to show them how wrong they were, but Vremic's reserve forces rushed to meet him. Deep within a side passage, 15 warriors had lain in wait. They surrounded him in seconds. Somehow he had leaped out of the frying pan and into the fire. Meanwhile, the survivalist Don Newmason was working hard to put a few arrows into the enemy ranks. An overturned mining cart provided her with good cover and a full view of the battlefield. 4 knights poured forth from an east passage and split up. Two running toward her and 2 toward Lieutenant de Gaulle. Concentrating upon those closest to herself, she hit the lead knight in the thigh, but he barely slowed. Bran McCune joined her. "How's the view from up here?" he asked with a smirk. "Nice of you to join us, McCune. Oh, you know how busy I can get admiring your form. I almost forgot to help you." "Funny," she said, drawing her sword and dagger, "but I'm a little busy right now." Rushing out of hiding, she crossed blades with the evil knight a moment later. McCune fired a bolt at the second knight, and he fell, poisoned. Reloading, he waited for another shot. "Lovely Dawn," the knight said. "You've spent so much time training that you've had so little opportunity for more ladylike pursuits." "You attempt to read my mind," she said, "when you should be concentrating upon my sword instead." "Ah, but they are indeed the same thing. You will all fall before our might." "I think not so, knight. Look deeper into my mind. What do you see?" "I see a black elven wench, unable to find love amongst her own, one who is doomed to now die alone." "That was your mistake," McCune said from behind him. "She is most certainly not alone." The knight's grip loosened and his sword fell. His legs weakened and he swooned. McCune drove his knife deeper. Pulling it out with a violent twist, he knocked the knight to the floor. "Remember, Dawn," he said, using her first name, "never alone." She could not now know what he meant. There was no time for such matters in the heat of battle. She might ponder it later. There were still sentients to kill. "Sergeant Carnage," Draco said. "2 sorcerers are making things difficult for Olac. I see them. How do you want to play it?" "Try and work your way around the fighters. Don't engage anyone except the wizards unless you have to. I'll try and sneak in for a killing stroke along the right wall." "Luck then," Carnage said while speeding off into the midst of the fighting. "Luck," Draco whispered. Moving like a hunting cat, he slipped through the mine debris. Combatants now filled the entire passage. It was utter chaos. There was no safe position, but his shadowy movement had thus far gone unnoticed. Creeping closer, he knelt by the cavern wall and raised his blowgun to fire. The sorcerers were riveted upon Olac and Jason at the center of battle. He took aim at his closest foe. It was then that he felt a strange contact with his mind. It was an invasion, a powerful will boring in and trying to possess him. Eyes tunneled into his back. Their hatred struck him like a hammer. He turned. A prone knight had fixed his will upon him. Paralyzed with poison, the sentient's mind was still powerfully aware. Draco's self-control slipped away. He thought that he raised his weapon to fight back, but instead he found himself aiming upon Newmason. He struggled to regain control. Sweat poured from his brow, but still he aimed at his comrade. He drew breath, fired, and reloaded. To her credit, Newmason remained standing. She even advanced to stand beside Jason, but her strength was quickly leaving her. She knew not who had struck her. He tried again to resist, but aimed at her again. To his horror, he drew breath. It was then that McCune's dagger severed the spine of Draco's controller. "Not this time, puppeteer," he said. "This time I'll make sure." Newmason fell to a knee. Seconds remained before the poison would kill her. He turned and fired his dart at a sorcerer, but it hit some invisible barrier and fell uselessly to the floor. New Mason would be dead if she did not receive the antidote immediately. There was only one way to administer it in time. It stung her. She rolled away and tried to stand. "Stay down," Draco commanded. Her anger kept her heart beating. It kept her breathing. There was no need for apologies between them. They were soldiers. He looked for McCune, but he did not see him. Jason needed help. He drew swords. He felt violated and totally used. To say that his ire had risen would have been an understatement. His blades were of his own design. He did not forge them himself, but the master smith had constructed them using his own design ideas and sketches. Well balanced and perfectly weighted, his swords had slightly tapered ends that gave them extra weight when used for slashing and chopping. The hilt's design protected the hands with cutlass-style pommels that could deliver punishing blows. The blade guards were full but not oversized, with 2 fork-like protrusions for weapons trapping. The mastersmith forged them of adamantium with dark eldritch magic and honed the blades to razor-sharp, nearly indestructible edges. He trained with them endlessly for occasions just like these. 2 knights circled Jason, and Vremick was moving to cut off any escape route. "Your end is near, de Gaulle," Vremick said. "We'll soon see how you fare against 3. "We shall indeed." He was without armor but not without weapons. An alien sword was his to command. The sentients read his mind, and although he was a tower of iron will, he could not stand alone against 3. They anticipated every move that he made. Every attack that they made was perfectly coordinated. Lacking his equipment, he had no components for spells, but the sword itself had other powers. He disappeared and reappeared a short distance away. The knights had to regroup. The teleportation was short range and random. They could tell when he would move, but not where he would end up. He knew it was just stalling, and if luck were all that remained to him, then he surely would have lost. But he was the leader of a valiant team. They just needed a little more time. In the midst of Talina's skeletal squad, Kayla Goldsmith worked hard against 3 dark knights. A like number of skeletal warriors remained animate, but the sentients hewed a great path around themselves, and the dead were falling fast. Hate empowered the knights, and their fallen comrades fueled their spirit of vengeance. Talina's magic suddenly stilled one of them. Paralyzed, the undead struck at him ruthlessly. His comrades shielded him and shattered the busy trio. Sergeant Goldsmith used the distraction to execute the disarming maneuver taught to her by her master, the venerable Li Anju. Stepping inside of her enemy's guard, she drove her long spear's head forward in a lightning-fast figure 8. The knight looked on in disbelief as his 2 hands and great sword fell to the ground. Trying to tackle her, he charged at her recklessly, knowing that his fight was over. Simultaneously, he spoke to her in his mind. "Kayla, Kayla," he said, "your fight against the minions was noble. Join us, and we shall make you a queen." The minions are our own common enemy, but that's the only thing that we have in common. Lay down your weapons now, Kayla, and we shall spare your life. I only see the 2 of you. Maybe you should have brought a few more friends along. Her training in avoiding charging opponents led to his immediate misfortune. His arms closed over empty airspace. A simple sidestep and duck, and she was then behind him. Her spear thrust out lightning fast, and he fell dead, 1 small cut just beneath his helm. Her second thrust passed through the frozen knight. In order to save himself, he retreated to the astral plane. The sentients had developed an innate ability during their torturous enslavement beneath the minion's yoke. His body became non-corporeal first, and then soon disappeared, but whether Talina's spell would then be broken was a mystery. Kayla was surprised but not baffled, and she recovered quickly, just in time to receive the 3rd knight's thunderous stroke. Rotating her body, she withstood it, but it was only through years of training that she avoided death. This warlock was now without reason, completely berserk. He lashed out at her with violence only possible when one no longer has concerns about his own well-being. Every few moments an invisible hand would strike him, and Kayla knew that the priestess must be behind it. The knight's rage grew and grew. He was beyond speech, in a place where only mad babbling might exist, or perhaps some insane, wretched drooling. Whatever the case, she had her hands full. Ducking, rolling, she parried and countered, cutting the knight repeatedly. His mind was past the pain, living on in a deep pit with only one thought remaining to him, to kill his enemy. Kayla's skill was to her credit, but that alone would not save her. Her own anger grew, for there was no other way that she might match such a foe in mortal combat. Savagely assailed, his pommel stroke broke her nose. Cut, battered, 4 of her teeth flew from her mouth, her ribs cracked, and several of her fingers broke as she struggled in defense. She watched, waiting for the right moment, dropped, and then pierced the knight through the heart. His sword fell, striking her again all but weakly. Twisting her spear, she tore it free. He fell. She stood. Stepping over his carcass, she advanced to face another opponent. 2 sorcerers remained in the party of Remick. Their focus was still upon the golden sword of Ilion and upon the dark elf rushing toward them. They lashed out at him with spells of lightning and flame, but the elf's resistance had thus far saved him. To counter this, they invoked a spell of summoning, and the young Sergeant Feldman Carnage soon found himself engaged with a horrifying adversary that only he could see. Grappling with the beast, streaks of red appeared in his flesh where its invisible talons fell. He struck it with dirk and rapier. Raised up and hurled down, he rolled with it and came to his feet. Just in time, his blades licked out and its claws dug deeper, cut deeper. He would not quit, but it seemed like he was fighting a losing battle. It was then that his mind dwelled upon a savory plate of diluvian mussels, a Shang Tsung delicacy. His mouth watered and then bled. He smiled and hit the creature ever harder. The beast seemed invincible. It hefted him aloft again, and its slavering maw opened. Its great paw deposited him inside of it, swallowing him down into its abysmal gullet. The youngest son of Baron Carnage tried to chamber his blades for a last, desperate stroke. It held his arms fast. Then suddenly, the creature was gone. Something had broken the wizard's spell. Feldman landed on his feet. Bloody and laughing, he ran to meet the Warlocks hand to hand. Only one remained. The rightmost one was dying in McCune's clutches. He now knew who his mysterious benefactor had been. The sorcerer, Dravian Oblesk, knew that Carnage was coming for him. His comrade was dying with a knife in the back, and it was clear that they were fighting a losing battle. He had very few battle spells left, and only 2 of escape. He could not leave the field without Vremick's orders, so he opted instead to teleport himself to the rear of their reserve forces. They surrounded an elf that would be an easy target for his spells. Olac Tempestus stood alone, with 15 fighters bearing down upon him. They converged, and he seemed to grow smaller, one tiny elf surrounded by beings who had once been men. He froze. Fear paralyzed him. His face portrayed horror. He held his swords as if he had accepted his fate. 6 knights attacked him, and he crouched ever lower, 6 utterly committed blades, crashing down to destroy him, their cuts beyond withdrawal. It was then that he moved, explosively, precisely, eviscerating one knight, crippling another, and finally escaping through a tiny, fleeting phantom gap in the enemy's ranks. The other 4 careered clumsily into one another, completely caught off guard. Keep moving, he thought. Surprise will only gain me a moment or 2, and he meant to capitalize upon it. 9 knights remained guarding the perimeter. They struggled to organize an attack against him. Magical bolts thumped into him, but somehow they were absorbed without hurting him. Dravian grew more frustrated, more enraged. These black elves had some resistance to his magical might. Perhaps a bolt of lightning would finally stop this elf. Anger clouded his judgment, because Olac was an unclear target amid a sea of foes. Lightning scorched forth, burning through 3 knights before it came near to Olac. Singeing his back, his hair stood on end. Ever on the move, he won his way clear. It struck 3 more sentients before expending its energy. Smoldering and badly hurt, they fell gasping to the floor. His burns brought pain enough to stop lesser men, fuel to a man such as him. Their eyes showed their uncertainty. They feared him now. Surely they had never encountered an enemy such as him on any prior battlefield. Attempting to regroup, they tried to organize themselves against him. Rigid discipline and military training was obviously one key to their history of conquest. This was despite the fact that they prayed to a chaotically evil, disembodied brain. Clearly shaken by his skill at arms, they tried valiantly to steel their resolve. They knew that in order to defeat him, many more of them would have to die. But the great mind's punishment for their failure would be certain death, and so they pressed on. Vremic's orders screamed in their minds, "Bring him down, now!" They attacked him then, with the hopeless determination that fate's resolve brings. And that's where we'll end today's episode, halfway down, page 74. And next time we'll find out what happens to Vremic and his party of sentient knights. Thank you. Have a great night, and as always, remember to read The Drums of Doom, Part 2 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga, by me, in all the following novels. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great night.